Gruesome beheadings, government censorship, fear of reprisals, breaches of ethics. From the Middle East to New York, it's been a very difficult year for the press. That's the focus of this edition of World Press. I'm Dr. Tony Fellow, Professor of Communications at California State University, Fullerton, and this is World Press, the news and documentary show that monitors press freedom throughout the world. It was one of the toughest and roughest years for press freedom, according to the latest report by Reporters Without Borders. That's the Paris-based media watchdog, which ranks countries by the press freedoms governments have accorded the press during the previous year. According to Christian Science Monitor reporter Michael Holtz, last year's beheadings of Western journalists by the self-described Islamic State were among the most visceral attacks on the press in decades. It's a year, he says, reporters would soon forget, and not only those on the ground in Syria and Iraq. The most gruesome was the beheading of Japanese journalist Kenji Goto. Why Goto and why Japan? We turn to World Press correspondent Ru Furukawa.
Japan now calls the Kenji Goto beheading their 9/11. Japan had no idea it was in a fight with the Islamic State. All Japan had done was to contribute a couple $100 million in humanitarian aid to countries fighting ISIS, while the executioner with the British accent known as Jihadi John murdered Goto. He threatened death to every Japanese person on the planet.
More about the dangerous state of today's press when we return.
What are you doing?
I'm not gonna lie, definitely not easy.
Hey, whoa.
Just gotta get through the day.
How do you stop it?
Being used to doing something with a cigarette makes it hard doing it without one. If I can relearn to get through my workday without cigarettes, I can relearn anything without cigarettes.
Relearn life without cigarettes, free at becomeanx.org, a new way to think about quitting.
It's easy to understand why Reporters Without Borders named the Middle East the most dangerous place for journalists the past year. The spread of Islamic extremism in the Middle East to the civil war in Libya has caused alarm. However, the media watchdog organization noted that Europe has not been a safe place for journalists and continues to slide downward in its ranking of press freedom. Reporters Without Borders says the European Union appears eager to compromise on press freedom. They made it clear that journalists from Denmark to Hungary risk persecution for exposing government corruption and publishing critical views of ruling officials, or risking death by publishing information or political cartoons disapproved by the Islamic extremists, as we saw recently with the French satirical weekly newspaper Charlie Hebdo. Such actions add fuel to the debate whether the press is too free or just not using good judgment when poking fun at terrorist groups. We turn to World Press correspondent Jarrett Brass.
On the morning of January 7th, around 11:30 in Paris, two brothers, Saeed and Sharif Kayuchi, forced their way into the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. Armed with assault rifles and other weapons, the two killers, identified as belonging to the Islamist terrorist group Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen, killed 11 people and injured 12 others in the building. Several attacks followed in the region, where 5 more were killed and 11 more were injured. The killings give rise to the free press debate and whether Charlie Hebdo went over the line in poking fun at Muslims. We are talking to media law expert Dr. Jason Shepard, a professor and chair of the Department of Communications at Cal State Fullerton.
Well, I think for the kind of magazine that Charlie Hebdo is, it's a magazine that pokes fun at people in power, at religious authorities, political authorities, and so in the context of political and religious satire, it makes sense that they would publish images to get people to be talking about the issues that they're trying to provoke discussion about. So I think in the context of mass communication and what Charlie Hebdo stands for, it was appropriate that they used this imagery to communicate ideas and get people talking about things that maybe they wouldn't have been talking about before. Anytime that news organizations or newspaper suffers a terrorist attack like Charlie Hebdo did, I think it is going to have an impact and an effect on what people print or publish in the future. You can't help if you are a news organization or a media organization that engages in satire and offensive satire, you can't help but think that the response may be extreme. And so I do think, I think that the terrorist attacks on Charlie Hebdo will give people pause about what to publish or what to air. And I think that's, on the one hand, understandable, but I also think it's really dangerous if people start self-censoring themselves because of threats of terrorism. And I think it's important for media producers and media consumers to be as informed as possible about the importance of press freedom and free speech.
Thank you for that report, Jared. When we come back, we'll look at the downfall of America's #1 anchor. We'll be right back for more of World Press.
So, are you going out tonight?
I can't. My parents say I have to be home right after work.
That's so gay.
Totally gay.
Ugh, that is so Emma and Julia.
Why are you saying that's so Emma and Julia?
Well, you know, when something is dumb or stupid, you say that's so Emma and Julia.
Who says that?
Everyone.
Imagine if who you are were used as an insult. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
Journalists, particularly on-air anchors, are truth seekers. For some, a trusted friend. For others, a part of the Fourth Estate, the people's watchdog on government. But what happens when the journalist makes up or embellishes his or her facts? World Press turns to its attention to America's #1 anchor, NBC's Brian Williams, where we witnessed his rise more than 10 years ago and just recently his downfall. Reporting on the rise and fall of Brian Williams is World Press correspondent Marissa Plasencia.
Brian Williams was caught with an egg on his face when he embellished a January 30th nightly news segment about being in a helicopter that was shot down by a rocket-propelled grenade during the opening hours of the Iraq War in 2003. But what was to come stunned NBC officials with a gusher of untruths uncovered by fellow journalists. Like the time he met SEAL Team 6 on a military flight into Baghdad, and when he received a knife and a piece of fuselage from the stealth Black Hawk that crashed during the Bin Laden raid in Pakistan, or when he claimed to have witnessed a man commit suicide inside the Superdome when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, or when he encountered a dead body floating face down in the French Quarter, or the time he escaped gangs overrunning his hotel, or the time he contracted dysentery by drinking polluted water. He went from being the anchor who could deliver a joke to the butt of them. World Press met up with former television news anchor and professor of broadcast news, Beth Bingham George, to discuss the role of an anchor and whether Williams can be rehabilitated as a trusted American source of information. As a former reporter in LA, how bad do you think the Brian Williams story was? Does it affect the way Americans view the news?
You know, regardless of whether I was an anchor or not, I think we should all be appalled as just consumers of news. This was, like the most serious ethical violation that we can make in journalism is to fabricate our stories, to lie about our stories, to not be truthful to our audience. And it has such a long-term impact that the audience will remember this. Our viewers are going to remember this, and then they're going to question other stories coming forward. So not even does this impact just us who work in TV news. I see this as having a huge impact in how consumers consume news. They just aren't going to trust us. I mean, this was a huge violation of ethics.
In your opinion, can Brian Williams rehabilitate? Will he be able to one day come out of this and regain his credibility?
You know, I say no. I don't think so, but you never know. I mean, one of the big problems I see right now with news divisions at networks, at smaller affiliates, is they're run by people who aren't news people. So that is not to say that NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast, might someday find a place for him somewhere else. But I really hope that he does not go back into that anchor chair after his suspension, and I really hope he's never in journalism again, because that would send a strong message to our audience that we in the field of journalism are just not going to tolerate that.
Is there any advice you can give to broadcast journalism students or Titan TV reporters that will impact their trustworthiness?
I'm going to answer this in two ways. I mean, it's a big question. I mean, one, I think the field of journalism has never been more exciting, and I think the opportunities are just, there's just an abundance of opportunities for journalism students. Maybe not so much in traditional journalism in newspapers, but there's a lot of opportunity out there. And here's my advice to young reporters or mid-level reporters or students of journalism is just don't. If you think you're violating an ethical issue, you probably are. So just don't do it, because it could be the end of your career.
Thank you. We'll be back with our press correspondents roundtable after this message.
The forest is special, magical, and very precious. One careless act caused by people, and its beauty could be gone for a lifetime. Protect our friends in the forest.
We'll all pitch in.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
To find out more, log on to SmokeyBear.com.
Welcome back. We conclude our program with our roundtable, snippets of challenges to press freedom around the world. We begin with 3 stories from South America. We first turn to world press correspondent Cassandra Zavala, who has been covering developments in Peru.
Thank you for having me. So I've been covering this story about ex-president Alberto Fujimori, who has now faced an additional 8 years to his 25-year sentence. Now, the reason why he got convicted was because a representative of his is known for basically paying newspapers about up to $3,000 so that they can possibly smear his opponents. And all of this was going on during his election. Now, this is very interesting because now we know that his daughter, Keiko Fujimori, is running for presidency. So we'll see how that turns out.
Thank you very much for that report. We're now going to turn to a neighboring country, Colombia, and World Press correspondent Daniel Inga has been covering a free press story that has been brewing for 2 years in that country. Daniel, welcome.
Yes, in Colombia, neo-Nazi groups have been sending death threats to Gustavo Riojas, the editor of the Bogota-based news website, Las Dos Orillas, for about 2 years, according to a Reporters Without Borders report. And the latest threat came from a right-wing group called Restauración Nacional, and this highlights the dangers that journalists face in Colombia when reporting on serious issues. And for the last 3 years, Riojas has been investigating links between neo-Nazi groups, paramilitaries, and politicians in Colombia, and has received many threats with relation to these reports. And to make things worse, the government withdrew a bulletproof car that they provided Riojas for protection during a recent risk evaluation, which adds to fear for his safety. And according to the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, Colombia is ranked 124th out of 180 countries. And after several reports of attacks on journalists by criminal gangs, paramilitary groups, and others such as this right-wing group in 2014.
Thank you for that report on Colombia. We now turn to neighboring country, Ecuador, where President Rafael Correa is declaring war on his opponents. I guess we can call it a war of tweets. Here to explain is World Press correspondent Andrea Weisenbach. Andrea, welcome.
Yes, Ecuador's President Rafael Correa stated for every lying tweet that his opponents send out, he and his supporters will send 10,000 that are truthful. The president has created a website and Twitter account to issue digital counterattacks by his supporters to speak out against who he calls defamers. Critics are calling this another act in the war on freedom led by the president. He has been criticized as intolerant. In fact, since 2012, Correa has won $42 million in libel suit cases against the country's largest opposition newspaper. He even passed a law a new law, a media law, making the government panel the arbitrator of journalistic fairness or review. He forced the paper's top dog political cartoonist, Javier Bonilla, to correct his cartoons that portrayed him in a negative light. Apparently, he doesn't want anyone laughing at him or criticizing him. He also doesn't like satirical memes. One artist on Twitter named Crudo Ecuador released memes of Carrera, and he was then shut down by Carrera suspectedly. His Twitter was suspended for a week. So he's regulating the war of freedom on Twitter strongly.
Lots of challenges. Thank you for that with South American newspapers today. And now we turn to another continent, and we have a story from Turkey today dealing with press freedoms there. And the story is going to be told us today by Tyler Petzmeyer. And what is that story all about from Turkey?
Well, Turkey, you don't think is being much involving much bad news about journalists, but they're right there with China and Iran right now with about 40 journalists behind bars. And they're being charged with being involved in terrorist activities and endangering state security. Their charges are being forced onto the journalists in Turkey to justify the current crackdown on the media. It appears that this is the only valid way for the Turkish leaders to silence or censor the people while shielding themselves from being as infringers of the freedom of speech and expression, which is protected by the international law. It has become the norm to limit journalists by charging them with lawsuits, criminal complaints, and dismissals. And if those taxes do not silence journalists, they're being charged with terrorist acts.
Turkey in bad shape right now with these charges, and it's unfortunate because this is a country where its citizens do read newspapers. They're in about the same state the United States was in 20 years ago when everyone subscribed to a newspaper. And they also have very much concerns about whether they're going in another 10 or 20 years, whether they're going to be in the same state where these newspapers will dwindle. But having been there, it's some very intelligent journalists, and sorry to see that these press problems do crop up. Thank you for that report. And thank all of you for these enlightening reports. And that's our broadcast for today. I'm Dr. Tony Fellow, and you've been watching World Press from the Titan Communications Studios at California State University, Fullerton, and stay tuned for another edition of World Press.